Georgia is bounded on both north and south by the Greater and Lesser Caucasus, respectively, and is split down the middle by the Surami Range. The Greater Caucasus stretches from the Black Sea to the Caspian, traversing over 750 miles, or 1,200 kilometers, and reaching as wide as 150 miles, or 240 kilometers. On the western side, the mountains run straight into the Black Sea, making travel through the region throughout the whole of antiquity difficult. In this range are found some of the tallest mountains in Europe. There is a small strip between the Greater Caucasus and the Caspian Sea that can be traversed from north to south, or vice versa, relatively easily compared to the rest of the Greater Caucasus, but this has been historically well protected by fortress cities on either end. There are a few passes through the Greater Caucasus aside from this coastal strip, but they are easily blocked by shifting weather, avalanches, and landslides. The best way goes through the Jvari Pass and Daryel Gorge, stretching from Stepan Sminda, aka Kazbegi, to Vladikavkaz, Russian for holder of the Caucasus. When Russia took over Georgia in 1801, they started improving this pass to give Russian troops easier access to Georgia, completing the Georgian military highway after about 4 decades of work, stretching all the way from Vladikavkaz to Tbilisi. There are a few very poor quality passes in the west, but there are no more ways through that are worthy of note. Other roads and rail lines have been made using these paths or by just tunneling into the mountains in more recent times. The Lesser Caucasus stretches from Trebizond and Batumi in the west, through the Armenian highlands and including Mount Ararat, all the way to the southern parts of the Caspian Sea. The Surami Range is much shorter than both of these Caucasus. Despite these difficulties in travel through the region, some branches of the Silk Road did run through Caucasia, making the region valuable for trade between east and west throughout antiquity. There are hardly any seafaring traditions amongst the locals of the Caucasus, save for a few linguistic artifacts in Phoenician, with few serviceable ports, and those that are being only moderately to barely so. Throughout antiquity, other peoples, such as the Greeks, Romans, Russians, and Persians, have been the main seafarers on the Black and Caspian Seas, first 2 in the Black Sea and the second 2 in the Caspian. There are 3 major rivers in Caucasia. The Kura, or Mutkvari, runs through eastern Georgia and Azerbaijan, spilling out into the Caspian Sea. The Araxes runs along the borders that Armenia and Azerbaijan have with Iran, joining with Mutkvari shortly before emptying into the Caspian Sea. The Rioni, or Phasis as it was historically known, flows through western Georgia and spills out into the Black Sea. None of these rivers have been viable trade routes throughout history, with far too many rapids and seasonal snowmelt and rains changing the levels of all the rivers massively and somewhat erratically. There are thousands of smaller rivers, their deltae making it hard to sail along the coast. There are 4 main climate regions in Caucasia. In the Greater Caucasus, there are extreme winters, hot summers, and brief intermediate periods. In western Georgia, it is very humid and arable, ranging from subtropical on the coast to heavily forested near the Surami Range, and on the Surami Range, with some wide open plains between. With the Surami Range forcing most of the rain from the Black Sea to drop on itself and western Georgia, eastern Georgia and Azerbaijan are markedly drier than western Georgia, ranging from scrubby forest to wide open plains to desert as one passes from the Surami Range toward the Caspian Sea. In the south, within the Lesser Caucasus, conditions are similar to the Greater Caucasus, although it is markedly drier. There is a wide variety of plant and animal life in the Caucasus, parts of the region known for wide swathes of forest often dense all the way to the tree line, as well as massive, fertile plains. Fun fact, the pheasant is thought to have been named after the river Phasis, which was the ancient Greek name for the Rioni River. This region, in antiquity, had widely varied people groups and languages, given the numerous peoples that came to and passed through it for trade and war, and the insularity of the inhabitants ensuring the survival of native cultures. It is mentioned by Pliny the Elder that the Romans needed 130 interpreters to navigate the port city of Dioscurius. Strabo claimed that in the area of the Black Sea coast between the 2 Caucasus alone, there were 70 linguistically distinct tribes. The Arabs called Georgia a mountain of languages. A few distinct groups remain separate from the mainstream Kartuli-speaking Georgia of today. In Svaneti, Abkhazia, and Samegrelo, languages distinct from Kartuli exist. Even within the rest of Georgia, regional distinctions remain strong amidst Kartuli speakers, especially in Ajara and Guria. In the southwest, the language takes on non-standard regional forms, mixed with Greek and Turkish languages, in the regions formerly known as Tau, Klarjeti, Lazga, and Erusheti. In Armenia, they speak their own distinct language, which has a script markedly similar to Old Georgian. In Azerbaijan, they speak Azeri, a language different in origin from other languages here, as Azerbaijan was created by Muslim Turkish invaders in the ruins of the Old Kingdom of Albania, that was by that time long since shattered by the Muslim Arab invaders and the Persians before them. the territory divided between several emirates. There are many other smaller pockets of distinct languages and dialects within Caucasia. While this is the nature of mountainous areas, speech in the lowlands can also vary noticeably from region to region to this day. In antiquity, Armenia and/or Georgia, as well as ancient Albania, enveloped areas between Trebizond, Erzurum, Lake Van, Nakhchivan, Baku, and the Greater Caucasus. Georgia has at times included the northern parts of what is now northeastern Turkey, and has always encompassed the traditional heartlands in the northwest of the Caucasus region. Armenia has at times extended to flood the whole southern half of this region, occasionally even beyond that, its modern incarnation being a shriveled, war-torn fragment of what the country once was. Albania typically encompassed the northeast of this region, generally encompassing the area in and around what is today Azerbaijan. To the north of the Greater Caucasus is built a slew of migratory raider folk, steppe peoples consistently settling in the region, then getting pushed out by the next wave of new peoples. Sarmatians, Alans, Ossetians, and Khazars have all held this position, as well as others, such as the Mongols, Huns, and Dagestani. The Caucasus region has been identified as one of the earliest sites of confirmed human habitation, with some of the earliest examples of metalworking and mine-making found here. The Greeks arrived in the 700s BC and began to set up colonies on the Black Sea coast of Caucasus, the Greek name for western Georgia. Because Georgia was known to the Greeks as the eastern edge of the world, many playwrights and other artists have staged stories from Greek mythology in this region, including Jason and the Argonauts, he visited modern Kutaisi to get the Golden Fleece, Prometheus, who is said to be chained to one of the largest mountains in the Greater Caucasus, and Hercules. The Caucasus Bull was related to this region after all. The Persians came to rule the region around 550 BC, ending around 330 BC with the conquest of Alexander shattering the Persian Empire, but Caucasia was granted a brief respite from occupation by this conquest. In the sub-100s BC, Rome arrived in the region and became intimately allied to or rulers of the regions of Caucasus, Iberia, Armenia, and Albania, using the region to strengthen the eastern front against Parthia, and later Persia. Iberia is roughly modern East Georgia in the southwest sector now in Turkey. Christianity was adopted in Georgia by 327 AD, and served as a unifying force within Georgia as the rulers of the region began to slowly and uninterruptedly build a cohesive Georgian state. Georgia remained a sidelines participant in the many battles fought between Rome, or Byzantium as it was now known, and Persia, though they were usually fought over Armenia. In 640, the Arabs invaded, but their permanent influence in Caucasia was mainly outside of Georgia save for Tbilisi, with minor and major forays into other parts of Georgia. In 1048, the Celtic Turks invaded Caucasia and Anatolia, but the Georgians were liberated by a strong line of Georgian kings within a few decades, in the wake of Turkish civil war and infighting, including David the Builder and King Tamar, bringing about the Golden Age of Georgia, which lasted a bit over a century. When Jalal ad-Din, ruler of Quraim, was pushed out by the invading Mongols in 1226, Jalal invaded Caucasia and raided for resources he would need to reconquer Quraim, but Jalal was defeated by the Seljuks in Anatolia. The Mongols themselves arrived in Georgia in 1236 and conquered the place, taxing away the region's wealth and other resources, but over the centuries, Georgians slowly regained their power. From 1386 to 1394, the Timurids ravaged Georgia, stripping it of most of what the Mongols didn't take, as well as killing countless people. After this, the Georgians again tried to rebuild, but the next time, tragedy came from within. In 1442, King Alexander I split Georgia into three parts, ruled by his three sons, and this divided house fell to the Persians and Ottomans within the following decade. After the Ottomans overran Constantinople, Georgia was friendless, divided, and completely surrounded by Muslims, and the people had to fight constantly for their very existence. In 1492, Georgian kings began to seek protection from Russia. It took a century for them to get that protection in writing, in 1586, and a few decades more to get that help in action, in 1619. All of these moves quickly followed by Persia and Turkey aggressively reasserting their authority. The states in western Georgia had accepted Russian rule by 1650. In 1722, the Russians invaded eastern Georgia, occupied by the Persians, but they pulled out and brought even more destruction to eastern Georgia as the Persians re-established their dominance of the region. The Turks and Persians fought each other for dominance in eastern Georgia for the next half-century, Georgia continually appealing to Russia for help, until eastern Georgia accepted Russian rule. But this did not prove effectual, as the Russians provided no help until eastern Georgia accepted full Russian rule in 1801. By this time, Georgia was exhausted of the resources and manpower, yet its oppressors showed no signs of letting up, leaving Georgia with little choice but to submit to Russia, even though Russian help at this time was weak, ineffectual, or entirely non-existent, even when they were expected to help under treaties. Georgia, and Caucasus at large, remained a cantankerous and rebellious part of Russia throughout the next century as its autonomy was slowly stripped from it, piece by piece, including the deposition of their royal dynasty, which the Georgians were assured would not happen, the subordination of their local Georgian Orthodox Church to the Russian Orthodox Church, and the enforcement of Russian language and lifestyle over those of the Georgians. In the chaos of the Soviet revolutions of the early 1900s, Georgia was able to declare its independence in 1918, only to lose it again in 1921, when the Soviets reasserted themselves and their dominance over the territories that Russia held, such as Georgia. The Georgians would remain a rebellious and troublesome part of the Soviet Union and its most valued tourist destination, bringing more wealth to Georgia than almost all other parts of the Soviet Union, for the next 70 years, declaring their independence from the Soviet Union in 1991. Despite many rough times, Georgia has more or less pulled its act together, and is working on becoming a cohesive and well-ordered state, although they are hamstrung by the Soviet legacy and mindset left behind. However, they remain staunchly opposed to communism,